One of the most recognizable and contested religious sites in the world is found in the old city of Jerusalem. We know it today as the Temple Mount, a sprawling network of platforms, plazas, walls, gates, and cisterns, culminating in the shimmering dome of the rock. Jews know this area as a site steeped in history, as that of the first temple built by Solomon, and a later temple built by Herod the Great, which was a 35-acre complex of buildings and open courts more grand than its predecessor. This temple, Herod's temple, is mourned by Jewish people today and retains a special significance in the pages of Scripture and the annals of history as the temple Jesus knew. The history of the temple is intertwined with the history of God's chosen people, the Israelites. Abraham offered his son as a sacrifice and a test of obedience to God upon Mount Moriah, where the Temple Mount stands today. It is here that Solomon built the royal temple envisioned by his father David, as vividly described in the Old Testament book of 1 Kings. But this was no ordinary synagogue for prayer and study of the law. This temple was the center of worship for Jewish people worldwide. Thousands of them made their pilgrimage to worship here each year, some from more than 1,000 miles away. Within this temple, the Ark of the Covenant, which contained the tablets of the law, had been kept in its holiest chamber for generations. It was believed that where the Ark was, God was.
There was one building that we know of prior to Solomon's temple. That was some kind of a shrine at a place called Shiloh. But once the temple was built, it continued as the only building of its kind in the land.
Solomon, the wisest of men, proclaimed in his dedication sermon that the temple was a settled place for God to abide in forever.
The temple that Solomon built followed the tabernacle. And because of that, the ideas that associated with the tabernacle transferred to the temple. The main idea there was that God was present with his people at the tabernacle. So God was now present with his people at the temple.
It turns out, however, that Solomon's temple was not destined to endure forever, as Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians destroyed it in 587 BC. It would take another visionary hundreds of years later to reconstruct the glorious temple. Herod the Great was first appointed to power at just 15 years of age. As the years passed, he grew in stature and power and left a lasting legacy upon his people. At the end of his life, it was Herod the Great who ordered the wise men to report the birth of the King of the Jews, which was followed by the order to kill all the male children under 2 years of age in Bethlehem. The shadow of death followed the king for future generations. His son, Herod Antipas, reigned at the time of Christ's torture and death, and his grandson, Herod Agrippa I, persecuted the early church. Herod the Great began the work of rebuilding the temple in 20 BC, in the 18th year of his reign. He seems an unlikely choice to lead the project, and certainly his motives were much less pure than those of Solomon.
Well, Herod was one of the great builders of the ancient world. He built marvelous things in his own land. He built temples in other lands as well. He built public works for Jews in various countries. He had the money to do it. He was a complex figure, and I tell people this: he was, if anything, a man of extremes.
Herod's primary purpose was not to provide a temple for the glorification of God, since he also built temples to pagan gods for use by Gentile worshippers. His aims were simple. First, to create a magnificent structure dwarfing the palaces and citadels already constructed at Masada and Caesarea. And second, much like a modern politician, to appease his constituents.
See, the people never accepted Herod because he was, in their judgment, not truly, fully a Jew. And so, despite all the extreme things that he did, his people still didn't recognize him, still grumbled about him, still thought he wasn't really a king. He was not from the royal bloodline of the Hasmoneans who had preceded him. So I think Herod was, in a way, trying to prove to them that he was indeed a king, doing this on so grand a scale. And I have a feeling that inside, he may have also been trying to prove it to himself.
After the first temple was destroyed by invaders centuries earlier, the Jews under Nehemiah and Ezra re-established Jerusalem as the city of God's people. A smaller rebuilt temple constructed by Zerubbabel replaced Solomon's structure. The Hasmoneans, or Maccabees, rededicated this temple when Syrian armies had defiled it, and it continued in use until the time of Herod. When Herod the Great told the religious leaders of his plan to build a new temple, the Jews were fearful that the tearing down of the old temple might actually leave them without a place of worship. Herod assured the people that the sacrificial rituals would continue, and that he would not demolish the old temple until all was in place to begin the new one. In order to calm their fears, Herod brought on the scene 1,000 wagons, 10,000 workers, and 1,000 specially trained priests who would build the holiest part of the new temple, the nouse.
It was important that only priests build the nouse because priests were committed to a lifestyle of ritual purity.
The floor plan of Herod's temple remained similar to those of the tabernacle and Solomon's temple, only larger. The first of 2 rooms contained the menorah, altar of incense, and a table for special offerings of bread, all religious items with particular significance from times past. In these respects, Herod's temple was like its predecessors, with one extremely important difference. In Herod's temple, the holiest place was an empty room, because the ark had long since been lost. This second room in the reconstructed temple was built over a low stone outcropping, protruding through the floor. This was called the foundation stone, and Jews believed it was the foundation of the world. Though the ark, and thus the primary reason for the temple, was gone, the structure remained at the heart of the nation's political and religious identity. It was said that he who has not seen the temple has not seen anything beautiful. 2 descriptions of the temple survive, one from the historian Josephus, who saw the temple and wrote 2 major histories of the Jewish people, and another in the Mishnah tractate Middith, an oral tradition preserving memories of those who lived in the days when the temple stood. These historical accounts, combined with recent archaeological discoveries and architectural details of Herod's other buildings, provide clues to the appearance of the temple, as found in various models and reconstructions.
We have the retaining walls, we have the Herodian masonry, we have the double and the triple gate, we have the underground caverns, we have the remains of the Fortress Antonia on the north side. We know that it was across from the Mount of Olives. So there's no question that we have the site of Herod's temple.
While we may not be certain of the temple's exact appearance, we do know that Herod was one of the great builders of his time. In 1.5 years the priests completed the nouse, but the work was only begun. The top of the Temple Mountain was enlarged and the whole complex continued under construction. In fact, the temple complex was not finished until only a short time before it was destroyed in 70 AD, almost 90 years after it was begun. Such was the scope and nature of the work. Israel's temple was built in her capital city, Jerusalem, in a land once promised to Abraham and his descendants. Jerusalem had grown to nearly 25,000 residents. The much older city of David had expanded to the north and west. At first bounded by the Terapean Valley to the west, the boundary was now the Hinnom Valley, which curved to the southern border as well. As Jerusalem grew, its poorest inhabitants filled the lower city. The exclusive upper city was home to the elite. Herod built a magnificent palace for himself and his family in that part of the city. The palace complex included 3 great towers that overlooked the city. Further north was the commercial center of Jerusalem, the New City. In comparable size to the other quarters of the city, the Temple Mount dominated the eastern side. A survey of the temple ground reveals that within a massive retaining wall, workers deposited vast quantities of earth and stone, converting the existing mountaintop to an enormous platform. The platform served as a base for the entire temple complex. Stones in the retaining wall are still visible today. They are masterfully joined and weigh 30, 40, and 50 tons. One theory is that the largest were rolled in as cylinders and cut square on site. Adjoining to the north was the Roman fortress Antonia. A garrison was stationed there. The fortress's 4 towers might have seemed imposing had it not been dwarfed by the nearby temple. Most visitors to the temple entered from the south side. There they found a wide set of steps with 2 great gates, the double gate and the triple gate. These gates are sometimes called the Huldah gates, named after a prophetess in the Bible found in 2 Kings chapter 22. Countless Jews would have passed through these gates, including 2 distinct groups. The Yishaf, those living in Israel who visited the temple at least twice a year for the celebration of Passover and Yom Kippur, and the diaspora, those Jews scattered outside the nation for whom the pilgrimage to the temple might be an infrequent or even a once-in-a-lifetime event. Outside the gates, each visitor would immerse himself in water in a special baptistry called a mikvah to become ritually pure. Once inside the double or triple gate, the visitor came to a huge underground stairway running through the mountain and emerging at the top. There must have been routinely hundreds of people on these stairways in Jesus' time. After climbing the dark stairway to the opening above, the visitor would step out into the sunlight on a great plaza known as the Court of Gentiles.
Well, I think entering the Court of the Gentiles would have been something like going downtown in Chicago in the Loop or standing in Times Square. You would have been just surrounded by people, and people of all kinds.
More like an outdoor market, this uttermost court could hold thousands at once and was a place for purchasing animals for sacrifice and exchanging currency. The nouse, the central sanctuary, and its immediate buildings were all now visible, and it was clear that they were elevated above this court. Separating the court of the Gentiles from the further courts was a low wall with entry points at intervals. Called the Soreg, this wall was a barrier to non-Jews. 2 of the signs once displayed on this wall have been recovered. They each give the same warning: the Gentile who passes this boundary will bear the responsibility for his resulting death.
As far as Jewish sensibilities were concerned, Gentiles always brought the risk of impurity, of ritual impurity. And so that certainly was part of the reason why they were not permitted farther into the temple precincts.
Even the court of the Gentiles was holy ground, and worldly things had no place here. It was probably atop the great stairway that moneychangers set up their tables because coins used in everyday business bore images and were therefore considered in violation of the law of Moses. The profane could come no nearer to the sacred nouse than here. The expulsion of money changers and animal dealers was Jesus' most notorious expression against the temple. He brought to mind the prophets of old who spoke against the temple of their day before it was destroyed, speaking boldly in words and in actions. Jesus, by driving these people out, is saying through his symbolic act to take this as a preview of what will happen, that God will destroy this place unless there is reform. Jesus and those around him all knew what the prophet Jeremiah had said before the destruction of the first temple.
This house, which is called by my name, has become a den of robbers in your sight. Jeremiah 7:11.
Jesus' words as he drove out the money changers and sellers of animals in the temple echo the warnings and foretelling of the prophets. Is it not written, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations"? But you have made it a den of robbers. Mark 11:17. The temple, with its signs that threatened Gentiles with death, was an affront to God's future plan that would welcome faithful people of all nations. The den of robbers referred to the lesti, bandits who fought against Rome, who had only one vision of the future: the expulsion of Roman forces through war and the glorification of Israel among the nations of the world. A visitor to the court of the Gentiles who turned around to look south would have been overwhelmed by the sight of the royal porch. He or she would have passed under it while coming up the stairway through the mountain. The royal porch was built on the southern wall, a walkway with 162 massive stone columns in 4 rows supporting its roof. Each of these magnificent marble columns was 27 feet tall, and it took 3 men to encircle one with their arms. The roof structure was of beams and boards covered most likely with tile. Ornate workmanship decorated the ceiling 5 stories above the floor. At the east end of the royal porch was a chamber used as a meeting place for the Sanhedrin, or ruling council, probably just prior to Jesus' ministry. Continuing into the temple complex, the next enclosure was the court of women, reached by passing through the soreg. Every Jew, whether man, woman, or child, was welcome here, but women could not go beyond this court. In each of its 4 corners was an enclosed area with no roof, but a gallery around the top so people could view what happened inside. First on the left was the chamber of the Nazarites. It pertained to the special requirements of persons under the Nazarite vow. Ahead on the left was the chamber of oils, where olive oil and wine used in the temple were kept. Ahead on the right was the chamber of the Metzora, where lepers came to complete their ritual cleansing. Directly on the right was the chamber of wood. Here, wood for the altar was stored. If an insect or worm was found in a log, it was rejected as unfit. 13 special receptacles for coins stood around the outside of the court of women, each for special offerings.
During one of these times that Jesus was within the temple, that he had come into the court of the women, and there, in that area of the temple, there were some receptacles for offerings. Jesus observed the wealthy placing their offerings into the various receptacles, labeled for different uses. And then he noticed a woman who was obviously poor, putting in 2 coins, 2 small copper coins. The coin is called the lepton. That's apparently the coin that she was using. And Jesus remarked to his disciples that this woman had actually done more than all the wealthy, because she had given all she had to live on. The amount of her offering may have been small, but with respect to the amount she had to give it was greater in terms of sacrifice and devotion than what had been done by the wealthiest there that day.
15 rounded steps ascended from the court of women to the Nicanor gate. It was made of brass and transported from Egypt by the person for whom the gate was named. On each side were small doors for people to use when exiting, as they were not to turn their backs on the nouse as they left. Passing from east to west through the Nicanor gate brought visitors deeper into the heart of the temple, into the court of Israel. No Jewish male was permitted to go beyond this court unless he was a priest. This temple court was where Jewish men came and waited to slaughter their Passover lambs. Separated from the court of Israel by a raised course of stones was the court of the priests. Here stood the great altar, 64 feet square at the base and 20 feet high. A ramp led to its summit. Here also was the laver holding water for the purification of the priests. To the right was a series of posts with hooks and stone tables, which were used for further processing of the animals sacrificed in the daily temple service.
Blood shed at this time was a tremendous amount of blood as well. There was a washing system, a draining system that took the blood from this part of the temple down through a channel in the heart of the mountain so that it came out in the Hinnom Valley down below.
At Passover, all the priests were on duty in this place, collecting the blood from more than 25,000 lambs as they were killed by the men of Israel, and passing the bowls of blood across the rows of priests to an altar where still more priests would throw the blood against the altar. After passing through the slaughtering tables of the court of the priests, we finally reached the heart of the temple, the nouse. The ascending levels of the courts leading toward the nouse were meant to convey ascending holiness. The court of the women was holier than the court of the Gentiles. The court of Israel was holier than the court of the women. The court of the priest was holier still. And within the court of the priest, the nouse was elevated by one last set of steps, indicating it was holiest of all.
Now, once the temple was built, the nouse was built, and the sacrificial system continued in that new nouse, priests could enter the first room, the outside room, and that was done by lot. Priests were in courses and they lived throughout the land. They were chosen by lot to burn incense in that part of the nouse. Zechariah, who was John the Baptist's father, was doing that very thing when the angel Gabriel appeared to him and announced the birth of John. Beyond that first room was the second room, the Holy of Holies. In Solomon's temple, the Ark of the Covenant had rested there. In Herod's temple, when the Ark was no longer with the people of God, that Holy of Holies was really an empty room. Still, the idea of the presence of God was associated with it.
The nouse was a long building, 17 stories tall, with a wide front or shoulder like a lion. Its face stones were white, so white that no one could look directly at the building in the bright sunlight. Gold plates also adorned the face of the nouse, though we do not know the extent to which they covered its facade. Above the massive door to the nouse stretched a golden grapevine. The vine was enlarged over time as new grape clusters were cast and added, made possible by gifts from worshippers.
Below that grapevine, there was a curtain. A magnificent curtain. It's called a curtain of Babylonian tapestry. It is said to have been a handbreadth thick. It must have been tremendously heavy. There were other curtains around the temple, but this seems certainly to have been the one that the Gospels say was torn in two at the instant that Jesus died.
This was the temple as Jesus, the 12, and the Apostle Paul knew it. Here, under the strictest of conditions, the perpetual cycle of Jewish worship went on to the praise of the one true God of Israel. If Jesus' temple cleansing was a warning of its coming destruction, the warning proved correct. The Jewish revolt, begun in 66 AD, brought Titus and the 10th Roman Legion to Jerusalem. Other legions joined in the siege, and at last the inner nouse was accidentally set on fire. The city and its magnificent temple fell to the Romans. As Jesus had predicted, not one stone of the temple building was left on another. The bloodshed that accompanied the fall of the temple and the city was astounding. Curiously, the historian Josephus reported that a number of signs signaled the coming destruction of the temple. Another Jewish writing, independent of Josephus, also revealed warnings about the temple, the Jerusalem Talmud, which began 40 years before the temple's destruction. While neither writer mentions Jesus, the time frame counting 40 years back from 70 AD, when the temple fell, takes us to 30 AD, correlating perfectly with the time of Jesus' public ministry and of his warnings to the moneychangers. The story of the temple does not end with the destruction in 70 AD. After its fall, the Romans and Byzantines built lavish palaces, churches, and temples upon its land. Eventually, the Dome of the Rock was built upon the mount from 687 through 691 AD. Today, millions flock to the Temple Mount. Muslims continue their pilgrimages to the El-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, which is thought to be the place where Muhammad met the angel Gabriel and ascended to heaven, and is the third most sacred site to Muslims after Mecca and Medina. Jews flock to the Western or Wailing Wall, kissing the sacred stones and cramming bits of paper holding prayer requests into its cragged nooks. Most importantly, Orthodox Jews wait for the day when the temple will be rebuilt and the sacrificial worship will be re-established, fulfilling the writings of the Old Testament prophet Malachi. Then shall the offering of Judah and Jerusalem be pleasant unto the Lord, as in the days of old, as in the former years. In the meantime, what significance does Herod's temple, the temple that Jesus knew, still hold today?
Beginning with Jesus and with those who came after him and wrote, we understand that the temple is a temple of living stones. Jesus is foundational. The apostles are foundational. And all of us are knit together in this growing building, this growing temple. A temple is, after all, finally the place where God meets humanity.
Numerous references in the New Testament link this temple to another that God is building even now.
Come to him, a living stone. Though rejected by mortals, and yet chosen and precious in God's sight, and like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. 1 Peter 2, 4 and 5.
The temple language here is unmistakable. Though the temple made with hands is gone, a new temple is being built by God, more each day, one stone at a time. And what is the temple but a place for God to be? Through the power of the Holy Spirit, the building goes on, until in God's time, the living temple will be complete.